I served in the South Carolina House of Representatives for 3 years and then was elected to the South Carolina Senate. Actually, I remember I thought I would be the youngest member of the Senate, and I walked in that day and there was Clementa Pinckney, who had been elected, I think, 2 or 4 years before me, and he was actually a few years younger than me. I think I was 31 or 32 at the time. So I served in the Senate for 16 years and am now the mayor of Camden. And when I was in the Senate, I served with many wonderful people, Democrats and Republicans from all across the state. Senator Pinckney, Reverend Pinckney, Clem is, what I called him, unless we were in a formal setting, of course. He actually was a little difficult to get to know. Clem was a quiet guy. He was gentle. He was very kind, but he didn't open up really quickly or easily. But we served together for, well over a decade, and I ended up being seatmates with Clem. And we were 2 of the youngest members of the Senate for most of that time. So we spent a lot of time sitting close to each other, at first on the back row, and then we moved up over time and ended up sitting next to each other. We served on a number of committees together. I think our relationship really became closer when I ran for governor in 2010 and 2014 because he was a huge supporter. And part of what he helped me with was outreach into the African American community. And part of that was me going to his churches, which I loved and very much enjoyed. And so I can remember back in 2009, 2010, actually spending time with Clem down in Beaufort. In his church, he had a little church down in Beaufort, wonderful, wonderful experience. His children were there, his wife were there, and my wife. And then he traveled around the state with me and went to different churches, different AME churches, just to introduce me to people. And we often voted similarly in the Senate, so he was a practical guy. He was not like an ideologue. He was a kind of I want to get it done kind of senator. So was I. And then of course I attended church at Mother Emanuel with him on a number of occasions as well, which was just amazing because it was so historic to be there with him in this wonderful historic place with just such history, and I learned a lot there as well. And then I guess the last thing I would say about Clem and our relationship was just I always felt like he had my back. He just, if I needed him, I could call him and he was a solid force to be there to have you. We had, just friendship moments. Being in the church in Beaufort stands out for me for some reason, I think because it was such a small little church and he was kind of rising up through the ranks of being a pastor. That was a really fun experience to be there with him in that setting. And then we also had some, more formal interactions in the Senate that stand out to me. I remember we had a big debate about voter identification and whether or not it would disenfranchise older voters who weren't born in a hospital, didn't have a birth certificate, which was fairly common in South Carolina, especially in the African American community many years ago. And, those were tough votes to take, and I remember I was one of only maybe 2 or 3 people in the Senate to vote against the final version of that bill. I think only 2, and it was me and Clem. And that really gave me a feeling of support to know that this other young senator was there voting the same way I did on a really tough vote. He also had this amazing voice. I'm sure other people will speak about that. And I remember, getting ready to vote on that bill, and everyone was voting aye. And I'm at the end of the alphabet, which means I vote last. And about midway through, I just heard this booming voice say nay, and it was Clem. Gave me a little courage to do what I thought the right thing to do was. Of course, I think we all remember his speech from the Senate floor after the police shooting down in Charleston with Walter Scott. The thing about Clem was he wasn't really the most engaged senator. In other words, he wasn't in the middle of everything. He wasn't a detail guy in the Senate. He was a moral guy. He voted his conscience. And he often relied on people like me who were a little more detail-oriented. And so he was willing to listen and ask. But once he made up his mind that he was right or that a cause was right, like you weren't moving him. So lots of memories. Of course, I remember the last day I was with him, the day that he was killed. And that, of course, is a very profound and sad memory. When that day that Clem was killed, which is how I think about that day. Obviously, there were others killed, but when you have a personal relationship with someone, that's what really stands out in your mind. We were at the end of the Senate session, and we both served on the Senate Finance Committee. We were both newer members, or younger members, I guess is a better way to put it. And he was sitting behind me on that committee. I remember he was really concerned with a vote that related to foster children and how some funding was allocated related to that. I remember him talking about that. It stands out in my mind because it's the kind of thing that he cared about. I think that was the day, it was either that day or that week, we were giving, in our Democratic caucus luncheon, we were taking up contributions to the custodial staff in the building. And I remember Clem giving money. I remember him handing the money. He was not a wealthy guy by any means. He was a church pastor. But those are the kind of things that just make me think of him and the things that I remember from that last day. And then I'll never forget, we had to adjourn that committee meeting, and we went into the Senate chamber, and then we were reconvening that committee meeting, and of course he sat next to me and he said, I'm not going to be at the Finance Committee meeting this afternoon, I think it was a Wednesday, because I have to go back to the church. And I thought to myself, I wish he was staying here because we needed the votes, frankly. But of course, after that, I really, really had wished that he had stayed, but fate is what it is. I went home that evening. I tend to go to bed a little early. My wife stays up late. I don't keep my cell phone around my bed when you're in politics. If you keep your cell phone around your bed, you're a crazy person because it rings all night long, or text messages come. So I don't have my cell phone around me when I sleep. And around 10:30, 11, sometime at night, I was asleep. My wife came and woke me up because our other friend, Senator Joel Lurie, was calling my cell phone, and Amy was worried. And I think maybe he called her cell phone, and she picked up. And we really didn't know what was happening. We just knew there had been some type of shooting and that law enforcement had locked down the church. And, we were all texting and calling Clem, and there was no response. And then the Senate's a small place. There are 46 senators. It's not like Washington, D.C., where people aren't in the chamber. We're in there together all the time. We spend all day together in the South Carolina Senate, which is good and healthy. And so, even though people disagree across party or geography, people care about each other. And so all of us, all 46 people to some extent were text messaging or calling all night long, just worried about what would happen. And I think we knew more or less about midnight or thereabouts that Clem had most likely been killed, but I think most of us didn't want to believe it, and I think it really wasn't until the morning that it really set in. And we actually had to go back to the Senate, which was really hard. It was at the end of the session, and we had to pass it was really late in the session year, and we had to pass a budget and to keep the state government operating. So we went back to the Senate that next morning, and there was a really small group of us that were called in the Senate leader's office, in the Senator Leatherman's office. Maybe 6 or 7 of us who were in the more, even though I was younger, I was still in a leadership role. And so we were called in there to talk about what we needed to do. And, we decided, and Senator Leatherman was very strong about this, that we couldn't let a murderer shut down the South Carolina state government. And so we, spoke from our heart from the floor that day about Clem. And I know there's some clips floating around, I think, from me and others. And then we passed a budget. And I remember talking to Mayor Riley on my phone from the Senate chamber, just devastated and trying to talk about what we could do to support the family and support Charleston and support the community. Yeah, it was a terrible day. For me personally, a difficult moment to make choices about how to react to what had happened, because all of us, I think, wanted to just shut down and mourn Clem. We didn't want to be in the Senate. We didn't want to really do anything except for cry and mourn and try to figure out a way to comfort Jennifer, his wife, and the family. But I had the year before run for governor, and taking down the Confederate flag had been a key issue in my campaign. Bakari Sellers and I had made it a core issue in the latter part of the campaign. And as we learned about the racist nature of the shooting, which I think we all suspected from the very beginning, but then we saw the Confederate flags on the license plates. And that next day, which I think was a Thursday, we had to start thinking, okay, what does this mean? And a part of me just wanted to shut it all away and say, I don't want to deal with any of this. But by Friday, I think it began to be clear that the public understood that racist actions and racist thought and racist publications and internet screeds, that they had real results, and this was a real result of it. And so we just started to pick up on the internet that people were reacting to this. And a group of us, I remember Todd Rutherford, myself, Marlon Kempson, Senator Marlon Kempson, Representative Todd Rutherford, Representative James Smith, we began to communicate about the fact that we were going to have to speak on this, and that we were going to have to do something. And so we very purposely tried on that Friday to begin to do interviews, and into Saturday to box in the other leaders around the state, because we knew what they were going to do, which is what they always do, which is say, now's not the time to do anything, now's the time to mourn, blah, 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 blah. And we were just convinced that we had to ramp it up, because if that flag was ever going to come down, it was going to be now. And it's terrible and sad and awful that it took Clem Pinckney being killed for that to happen. But that is the only way it was going to come down. And I knew Clem, and I knew that that's what he would want. So, we basically over the weekend deliberately created a strategy to pressure the rest of the leadership in the state, the governor, the U.S. senators, to be on the spot about it and not be able to just punt. And, at first they punted, and then by the beginning of the next week, we saw everybody kind of come around. And then I think there's this idea that then the flag just came down, but that is not what happened. It took weeks of planning, of pressure, of ramping up the effort, of drafting the bill. I drafted the bill that brought the flag down, and of having a strategy to make that happen. And that's probably a whole nother show. So unfortunately in that, those days following Clem's murder, we began to talk about bringing down the flag, pressuring other leaders to commit to bringing down the flag, building public support for bringing back the flag, doing interviews across the world. I mean, I was doing interviews in Europe about why the flag needed to come down. And it was clear to me, and it's still clear to me, and it's sad and it's terrible, and it's a terrible reflection on our state, that the only reason that it came down was because a state senator who we knew, who we were friends with, was killed. It felt very personal in the body to everyone who served with Clem. It felt like an attack on everyone, and that was because Clem was close to everyone, and he was a state senator who was friends with these people, and there was no way to ignore it. Whereas if it's someone that you don't know, it's easy to pigeonhole it and just say this is a terrible thing that happened. But when it's someone you know and you're close to, and it sits there and you talk to every day, it's impossible to ignore. And that's why the other leaders in South Carolina ended up allowing the flag to be brought down. And there was still opposition even then. In the Senate, not as much. And I think that tells you that the closer you were to someone, the harder it was to oppose bringing down the flag. In the House, there was opposition. There was opposition in the Senate, but there was opposition in the House. It was more. And I think that's simply because the greater distance you have from a person, the easier it is to ignore what happened. So I'll take us back in time to a church service I was at with Clem, where I spoke, and it was an African-American gathering. It wasn't a church service, but it was in an African-American church. And I'll never forget, Clem was there. He spoke about me and why my campaign for governor was important. But the memory is that after the service, as I walked out, an older African-American gentleman pulled me aside and he said, "Do you ever think we'll get the flag down?" And what I had noticed, and the reason I made it an important part of my campaign in 2014 was because when I was in the black community, I rarely was asked that question publicly, but I frequently was asked that question privately. And that spoke to me and told me how devastating it was to a large part of our community that the Confederate flag flew on top of the sovereign building of the state. So I do not underestimate, I used to, but I do not underestimate the value and the importance of bringing down the Confederate flag from the front of the State House. Issues, they come and go, and we will be back and forth on issues over time, but the culture needed to change, and symbols are important to cultural change. And the Confederate flag flying in front of the State House was a symbol of the culture, and moving that and taking it off the State House grounds changed the culture, and that leads to change in the future. And so it was really, really important that it happened. You know, especially in a state as deeply entrenched in history and with a deep culture that is somewhat its own compared to the rest of the country, that change comes slowly. And so I think that, you know, if you talk about race relations and if you talk about equal opportunity, I'd say we're probably about where we were 10 years ago. But that was an important step into the future that occurred 10 years ago. And again, I think I say this over and over again, because I feel like sometimes I hear people, leaders, or even just citizens talk about what a great thing the flag coming down was. And to me, it wasn't a great thing. It was something that needed to happen, but it was a terrible, terrible commentary on the state of South Carolina that it took the murder of a state senator and members of his congregation for it to happen. That is a horrible legacy for this state. That time, there were two things going on, and they were intermixed, and so they very much are wrapped up in my mind and in my heart, my emotion, and that was the effort to bring down the flag and mourning Clem at the same time. And those were two difficult things to do at the same time because one was overtly political and one was very personal. And I don't like to have my personal life in my politics, but in this situation, it had to be that way. And so that was difficult. We go on a family vacation every year in June and July, and that year we went right after session, but we had to come back into session if we were going to take down the Confederate flag. And so right there, after Clem was killed, we had to amend the law that allowed us to come back in session so that we could take up the debate on the Confederate flag. So right off the bat, in the days after his murder, we had to fight to change state law before we adjourned so that we could come back that summer to have a debate about the Confederate flag. Because I knew that if we adjourned for the year and we didn't come back to January and 6 months went by after that murder, that it would not come down because it would have cooled off and people wouldn't have felt emotionally tied. So there we are, planning to go to a funeral, making speeches about Clem on the Senate floor, mourning his death, and at the same time navigating to force the General Assembly to come back in the summer, a month later or several weeks later. And so those are the kind of things that I remember. I remember, you know, talking to the senior leadership of the Senate, telling them why we had to do this, arguing with members about the fact that we didn't need to wait 6 months to come back in and deal with this, that we needed to do it now. You know, I remember being at home and just shutting down and crying and just, it seemed impossible. It just seemed impossible that this giant, kind man had been killed. It just seemed impossible. And my heart just, I wasn't close to Clem's family. I knew the family, but I wasn't close to them. And my heart just went out to them. It was awful. I can remember some of my colleagues calling me. Where I was going with the vacation thing was we went to vacation. So I was at the beach, like with my family, you know, 2 weeks after these shootings, and I was planning to come back to try to force the Confederate flag down. And the entire vacation I was on the phone talking to members and lobbying members and working on the bill and having members call me and they would say things like, hey, you know, let's put an amendment on that allows a different version of the Confederate flag to be flown. Or, hey, let's just allow it to be flown on Confederate Memorial Day. And I'm usually a guy that wants to compromise, but I remember talking with others, Todd Rutherford again, Marlon Kempson, these senators, Tom Davis, who was supportive of bringing down the flag on the Republican side, and just saying, we are not going to compromise. It is coming down, end of story, nothing else. So there was more debate in the House. In the Senate, there was similar opposition, but it was just quieter. They didn't want to be out front on it. Our colleague had just been killed. So there was a few votes against it. There were a number of amendments that were put up to try to change the bill. We voted all those down in the Senate. In the House, actually, that debate started that morning, and it went deep into the night. And one of my memories is around 7 or 8 o'clock at night, I actually drove over from my house in Camden with my youngest son to go to the chamber, to lobby members, to talk to House members, to try to convince them that they needed to move on this. My son was, 13 or 14, and he was with me that day. It just seemed like a momentous, historic day, and he was with me. So he jumped in the car and we drove, and of course as a senator I could get into the House chamber, I could get in the back room. My son was introduced from the floor as a visitor, which was a nice gesture in the midst of a very emotional debate. I think that the vote was never in doubt. I think that there was going to be an opposition, and the opposition knew that they were going to speak and that they were going to have some extended debate and they were going to put up amendments. But there was a core group of Republicans and Democrats, a majority, that were going to pass that bill. I think the question really was, would there be amendments? And that was also the question in the Senate. Would there be amendments? And again, when I was there talking to members, I had a hard line, which was, we're not going to have amendments. This bill is going to pass like I drafted it. There are two memories in my mind that go together. And both of them occurred at the State House. One was the day of Clem Pinckney's funeral, when we stood watch at his casket as we watched the hearse circle the State House grounds. That was a very profound and moving day for me personally, and I think for the state to really mourn and come together. On the day the Confederate flag was removed, I didn't go to the State House. I didn't think it was a great day. I thought it was a shameful day. And I stayed at home, and I was glad that it came down. I was sad that it took the murder of my friend for the flag to come down. Unity is fleeting, and I think that was true here. And it was why it was so important to capitalize on that unity to remove the flag. Clem's funeral was a part of that process. Clem's funeral not only was an opportunity to mourn and come together and think about what really matters, which I think all of the senators really did in a profound way, but it was also an important symbolic moment that led to the Confederate flag being removed, because his funeral came before that vote. And it was mighty hard to go to that funeral where a racist killer had murdered your friend for any of us, and then think it was okay for the state of South Carolina to fly the Confederate flag in front of the State House grounds. So it was a profound moment of unity and opportunity for people to come together and also personally to mourn, but it was also a political event that led to the flag being removed from the State House grounds. Clem Pinckney was a large presence in the state. He was a pastor of a very historic and important church. He was a state senator. He was a father. He didn't prioritize being a state senator. If you ask Clem what was most important professionally in his life, it was being a pastor. I don't think Clem Pinckney ever thought or planned to have his portrait hanging on the Senate wall, and he would not have. He would have been just like the rest of us and, eventually gone and done other things. But he is now a symbol, and he did become a symbol of the state and the tragedy of the state, but also the opportunity of the state. And his portrait now hanging in the Senate chamber, his line in state at the State House, is part of the history and an important part of the history. And I hope it's a turning point in the history, that when we look back 50 years from now, we'll see that we moved closer together racially, closer together as a people because of it. Yeah, I don't begrudge people that forgive, but that's not my role. Clem was a friend. He was not family. And we weren't close friends. We were friends politically. We were friends as senators. We were friends as people who were close in age and spent a lot of time together. But yeah, my role is not to forgive in this instance. Because I saw Clem just hours before he was killed, it made me really appreciate the fleeting nature of time and time that we have to spend with each other. So I swore after that day I would not hesitate to tell people that I love them whenever I have the opportunity. As a legislator and now as a mayor, we tend to talk in policy terms. What bill could we pass? What legislation could we move? What executive orders could the governor do? What could we do on the local level? I'm pretty convinced after all this time that what has to change, that those are important. Don't get me wrong. Policy is important, but culture is more important. And so I think that what government can do, and it really is leaders in government, is help to change the tenor of the culture. And that means that from the governor to the senators to House members to mayors to others, that we need to speak about equality and the need for equality, that we need to speak about the need for to treat people the same, to be loving and to outreach to others, and that a culture that glorifies the past in South Carolina is not healthy. That a culture that confronts realistically the good and the bad is what we need to do. And so, you know, if you ask me what needs to change, it's really the attitude of leaders. And the attitude is we're going to embrace everyone in the state, and we're not going to celebrate the things that occurred in the state in the past that we shouldn't celebrate, but we'll still tell the story, and we'll keep our history true. Right, the thing that's gotten worse over the last 10 years is people's hostility toward other people, and political figures have led that charge. Political figures don't speak in terms of bringing people together, and the public doesn't react to political figures speaking about bringing people together. The public reacts to negativity and hostility, and elected officials have fed into that. And in my thinking, which perhaps is a little old school, but hopefully becomes new school again, political figures help shape the debate, help shape the culture, help shape the attitude by talking in terms of bringing people together, forgiveness, faith in the fellow man. And that's how our government was designed to work, and it's how our culture needs to work. So again, these cultural shifts dwarf even the governmental policies, but they are connected and related. You know, a lot of things have happened. I mean, Clemson started that scholarship and that program about Clem. I think that Jennifer and the girls have been like a shining example of what's good in the state, but they haven't tried to capitalize on it, which I think is like profound, because you know how a lot of other people do. I think the greatest danger is that we forget, that we too often forget in this state the things that we should remember, and we remember the things that perhaps we should forget. So I think that this is important. I think the fact that the Senate put Clem's portrait in the Senate chamber is important. I think it's very important that in our history that we begin to teach this to our students, what happened. Because this killer, he didn't radicalize in isolation. He radicalized because of the culture that allowed him to become what he was. He radicalized because of the culture that allowed him to become this evil, that perpetrate this evil. And so we all have an obligation, especially leaders, at a cultural level, to speak in terms that preclude these types of things from happening.